Hello everyone, today I wanted to go over my Witchcrafter deck that has been in the highlight videos recently and give a bit of a breakdown of the deck and some tips on how to play it. So let's just get straight into it. Here is the deck I've been playing with for the past week or so. I occasionally tweak a card or two, so sometimes you might see clips where I use a card that isn't in this list here specifically, and we'll also go through some of the possible alternatives on the side here of cards that I've played around with in the past and might want to add in the future. I'll try to go through this in a pretty straightforward manner, but might end up jumping around the place, but at the end I'll cycle through all the cards so that you can at least see the cards that I'm running. Before starting with the card by card, I'll just touch on the obvious point that we are running a 60 card deck here. This is going to make full use of that grass looks greener. This card effect works really well with the Witchcrafter archetype. The goal of any Witchcrafter deck is to get both your monsters and spells into the graveyard so that you can utilise their effect to their full potential, and this is where grass comes in. So what does grass do? So its effect reads, if you have more cards in the deck than your opponent, then you can send cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard until you have the same number in your deck. So with our deck having 60 cards in it and your opponent usually having 40, some will run a few more, but it's usually about it. We can easily get 15 or more of our cards, depending on how many cards you use to get to grass from our deck into the graveyard, and that will give us a huge advantage. If you don't draw grass on your first turn, then all is not lost, because this deck works really well at stalling games out to give you the highest chance to draw it eventually. Now I would like to add that this deck isn't the most competitive deck, but that's not why I made it, and that's not why I play it. I play this deck because it's a lot of fun, every game is different, and you really have to think about the plays you're going to make. And I have been able to manage to keep a win rate that's at least above 50% most of the time, so it's not like you're going out into each game at a huge disadvantage. So let's get into the deck. We have our four main normal summonable witches. There's Genny, Pottery, Pittore, and Shmieta. Each of these witches has two effects, one that you can activate on the field and the other in the graveyard, and both of these effects can be activated in the same turn. The on the field effect is the same for all four and says you can tribute this card, then discard one spell to special summon one Witchcrafter monster from your deck. This is one of the main ways you will get your boss monsters Hain and Vere onto the field. Additionally, I feel like it's worth noting at this point that this is a quick effect, which has two benefits. If you leave a Witchcrafter on the field until your opponent's turn, you can sometimes bait out a targeted destruction, and then just quick effect tribute the card, switch it out for one of your boss monsters, and essentially you've just wasted one of their cards. And the second is to counter Max C to some extent. Sometimes people don't read cards, and once you normal summon, they'll just use Max C in response. So you can then chain the tribute onto Max C, get your boss monster out onto the field, and not allow them to draw a card off of that summon. As for their grave effects, we'll go through them one by one to go over what each one does. So starting with Genny. While in the graveyard, you can banish Genny and a Witchcrafter spell from the grave, and this effect then becomes the effect of that spell. This works great with Holiday, allowing you to copy its effect to summon a Witchcrafter monster from the graveyard. It also works well with Creation, but you can copy any Witchcrafter spell in the graveyard, so there are many different ways to utilize this effect to produce great combos, but primarily you want to utilize it for Holiday or Creation. Shmieta, you can banish her from the graveyard to send a Witchcrafter card from your deck to the graveyard. Note that this is any Witchcrafter card and not just a spell, which means you can send any Witchcrafter monsters or traps as well. As a general rule, you'll want to use this effect to target By Street and get that into the graveyard. However, like Genny, there are many different situations that will call for a different card to be sent instead. Genny and Schmierda's effect are core to making this deck operate, and this is why we run 3 of each of these monsters. We want to either draw them in our starting hand or discard them with grass, and this gives us the highest chance of getting this result. On to Pottery. If you have no cards in your hand, you can banish her from your graveyard and return a Witchcrafter spell. Sorry, not a Witchcrafter spell, a Witchcrafter card from your graveyard to your hand. Unlike Genny and Schmierda, Pottery is less likely to be able to pull off her effect due to its empty hand qualifier, and because of this we only run 1 as a backup in situations where we need to return either Aruru or Patronus. Petore, you can banish her to draw 1 card and then discard 1 Witchcrafter card. If you don't have a Witchcrafter card in your hand to discard, then your entire hand will be banished. So don't go using this effect unless you either are using it to intentionally discard a Witchcrafter card, or if you're just really trying to pull off an extension play where it doesn't matter if you banish your hand. Petore isn't really necessary in this deck, but I play her, to keep the deck a little bit interesting and play along with the archetype a bit more. As for the other level 4 or lower monsters, we're running 3 copies of Max C. This isn't critical to the deck, but the draws when you're going second can really help this deck get into the match. And you could consider running the Psy-Frame Gamma package instead, but I've stuck with Max C. Fairytale Snow, we run this card because of its graveyard effect. You can banish 7 cards from your graveyard to special summon her, and when you do, turn 1 monster your opponent controls into face down defense position. This effect is huge and allows you to counter your opponent when they think you are out of interrupts and have let their guard down. It's very hard for the opponent to play around. If they try to negate the effect or use Called by the Grave on it, you can activate the effect again within the same chain and banish 7 more cards if you have enough to do so, and preventing the negation. If you have another copy or the materials to make another one, I would consider running 2 in replacement of Petore for just consistency purposes. Now for the main Witchcrafter monsters that you want to get onto your board during your turn, you've got Vere. This is your main boss monster, and she has 2 effects. The first is a field negate. You can discard a spell and negate all face-up monsters on your opponent's field. This is a quick effect which allows you to use it in retaliation to an opponent's effect. Unfortunately, this is only once per turn, but if you are familiar with the decks you're versing, you can usually identify the key points in their combos where you want to use this interruption. Her second effect is an attack and defense buff during the damage calculation step. When a spellcaster monster battles, you can reveal spells in your hand with different names, and grant that spellcaster monster 1000 attack and defense for each card revealed. Again, this is a once per turn, so you need to be careful when you are using it, but it's a strong effect that allows you to either destroy enemy monsters when they attack into you, or stall the game out for longer by preventing your monsters from being destroyed by battle. It can even allow you to do some one-turn kills on your opponent if you've managed to get enough cards into your hand. Then we have Hain. Again, like the others, she has 2 effects. One of them you won't notice most of the time, which is a passive effect which prevents your opponent from targeting other spellcasters with card effects. While it's not really an effect you notice all that often, if you have both Hain and Vere on the field, which should be your goal in most games, it's a great layer of protection for your Vere. Secondly, you can discard a spell to target 1 face-up card on your opponent's field and destroy it. A few things to note with this effect is that it can only target face-up cards and only cards on your opponent's board. It's not very often you need to destroy cards on your own field, but there have been a few instances where I've really wanted to do so and been unable to. Finally, we have Aruru. If you can get this card into circulation, it becomes very hard for your opponent to break your board. If your opponent targets a spellcaster monster you control with a card effect, or for an attack while this card is in your hand, you can special summon her and either return one card your opponent controls to the hand, or return one Witchcrafter spell in your graveyard to your hand. Usually I opt to return a card to the opponent's hand because this allows us to keep control of the board and prevent them from developing a strong board. During the opponent's standby phase, she will return to your hand, allowing you to use this effect again on their turn. So just be careful if you plan to end your turn with only a Ruru in your monster zones, because you're not going to actually have a spellcaster on the field during the opponent's turn, which you need to trigger her effect. On to the spells. I'm going to start with the Witchcrafter spells, then cover some of the Witchcrafter traps, and then I'll come back around to just discuss the generic spells I'm running in the deck. Now, like the smaller witches, all Witchcrafter spells have an effect on the board and an effect in the graveyard. However, unlike the witches, only one of these effects can be activated each turn, so you need to be careful about which ones you choose to use. All spells share the same graveyard effect, and that is, during the end phase, if this card is in the graveyard and you control a Witchcrafter monster, you can add this card to your hand. Now this means that if this card was sent to the graveyard for any reason other than you using it, you can return it to your hand. So this includes using it to activate a Witchcrafter monster's effect, sending it to the graveyard by grass, used as fuel for cards like Forbidden Droplet or any other cards that you choose to run that discard cards, and they'll be returned to your hand during the end phase, but only if you control a Witchcrafter monster. Now I will quickly go through each of their individual effects. Most of them are pretty straightforward, but remember, if you use this effect you won't get it back into the hand at the end of your turn. Creation. Add a Witchcrafter monster from your deck to your hand. You can use this as a starter if you did draw one of your low level witches, or you can use it to get a Ruru into your hand for the opponent's turn. Holiday. Special summon a Witchcrafter monster from your graveyard. Pretty simple, just monster reborn essentially. Collaboration allows the targeted Witchcrafter monster to attack twice during the battle phase. Draping. Return spell or traps on your opponent's field to their hand, up to the number of monsters you control. Up to the number of Witchcrafter monsters you control. Note that this isn't a destruction and only returns them to the hand. This card is pretty essential into Eldritch and other decks that run cards like Skill Drain or Goes and Match or any of those sort of annoying Floodgate trap cards. If those cards weren't so meta, I'd probably only run one copy, but alas, here we are. Unveiling. Special summon a Witchcraft monster from your hand. It also has a secondary effect, which means your opponent can't activate effects in response to your Witchcrafter effects for the rest of the turn. But as you can see, I only run one copy of this card, so I don't take advantage of that secondary effect all that often. I really just use it as a backup to get cards on the field if I really need them, or for OTKs. These next two spells are continuous spells. First is By Street. This is one of the cards you want on your field to achieve your ideal end state board. The first time your Witchcraft monster would be destroyed, they aren't. This allows your board to withstand a lot from the opponent and makes it tough for them to offer up multiple ways to clear your board when you've got disruption in the way as well. Second is Scroll. If your Witchcraft monster destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can draw a card. Both of these spells can be substituted for a card in your hand when activating a Witchcrafter monster's effect. However, you won't be able to return it to the field during the end phase because you've already used its effect. We only run 2 Witchcrafter traps. We have one copy of Masterpiece. Its on the field effect is pretty average. It allows you to target a spell in your graveyard and add a copy from your deck to your hand. It doesn't have to be a Witchcrafter spell, so On very rare occasions you can use this to get grass from your deck into your hand, but usually you're just going to use this card for its graveyard effect. You can banish spell cards from your graveyard and special summon a Witchcrafter monster from your deck with a level equal to the number of spells you banished. This works great if you can get it into the graveyard with grass. And note that you can't use this effect the turn it was sent to the graveyard, however you can use it as a quick effect on the opponent's turn. And our best trap in the deck, and a card that can easily add the most value if you're able to draw it, Patronus. This is a continuous spell that allows you to, once per turn, return a spellcaster. Doesn't have to be a Witchcrafter, just return a spellcaster from your banished pile or graveyard to the deck, and then add a Witchcrafter spell to your hand. If you have this in your starting hand, it can easily net you 4 cards, if not more, throughout the course of the match. It also has a graveyard effect which lets you target banished Witchcrafter spells with different names and add them to your hand. This allows you to recycle cards banished by Genny or Masterpiece or Snow, and because it adds them to your hand, it can allow you to pull off some huge combos with Very's attack and defense buff. We also run one generic trap, which is Lost Wind. It's a targeted negate which will negate the targeted monster's effect until it leaves the field, so it's not until the end of the turn. It'll also have the monster's attack, but like most cards in this deck, we use it for its secondary effect, which allows you to set this card from the graveyard to the field when your opponent summons a monster from the extra deck. Now for the generic spells that we have in this deck, starting with Grass. Your goal on your first turn should be to get Grass into your hand. For this we run a few cards that give us the draw power to do so. These include Pot of Prosperity, Pot of Duality, Metalfoes Fusion, which will allow you to shuffle this card from the graveyard to the deck and draw a card, and finally Left Arm Offering. I currently only run 2 copies of Left Arm Offering in this deck, but you could definitely run 3 for more consistency. If you have 2 or more cards in your hand, you can banish your hand and add 1 spell from your deck to your hand. Ideally, you'd be using this to add Grass. It has a few other conditions, but essentially you're giving up all the cards in your hand to get Grass into your hand, which is more than worth it in almost every case. We run 3 copies of Reasoning. It sends cards to the graveyard and it summons monsters, so it does everything that we need in this deck. For some reason my Reasonings seem to land on max C at an unreasonably high percentage of the time, but that's just my bad luck, I guess. Terraforming to add Secret Village of the spellcasters to our hand. We only run 2 copies of Secret Village, so you might ask, why not just run 3 copies of Secret Village and drop the Terraforming? And you can do that if you want, however I like Terraforming for 2 reasons. The first and most simple is that it puts extra cards into our graveyard, which can be used as fodder for Masterpiece or Snow. And the second and more big-brained reason is that we can use it to bait out an Ash, to let our Witchcraft attributes or Grass or Reasoning or Left Arm Offering or 1-for-1 or Creation or Holiday to make it through and not get ashed. Essentially it just works really well to bait out Ash, and it doesn't matter if it gets cancelled. And if it does, it allows us to use many of our other cards without fear of the ever-looming threat of Ash. We have 1-for-1, which helps in the situations where we draw one of our boss monsters in our starting hand. We can just send it to the grave and summon our Genny. Metalfoes Fusion, we use this for its graveyard effect. It allows us to shuffle it into the graveyard and draw a card. This is good fodder for a Witchcrafter discard, but it can also end up in the graveyard through Grass. Foolish Burial Goods, either you can send Metalfoes Fusion for a free draw, or use it to get an extra Witchcrafter spell into the graveyard. I run 2 copies. You don't need to run 2 or even use this card at all, but it works well with the graveyard effects of your spells and traps. We run the Magician's Hand engine with 1 copy of both of the hands and 2 restages. With all of our ways to send cards to the grave, we can get restage into the graveyard quite easily, allowing us to get one of the other spells into our hand. I have tried running only one copy of restage and found that it just wasn't consistent enough. And to finish off the spells, we just have 2 general negate cards. We have 2 copies of Called by the Grave and 2 copies of Forbidden Droplet. Into the extra deck. Now, most of the time you will be banishing your extra deck with Prosperity. So I've only really just added the cards here that I use often. Other than these cards, you can add what you want because it really doesn't matter too much. I have Artemis, which allows you to send a Witchcrafter card from the field to the graveyard if you don't have a spell in your hand to tribute it, but need it in the graveyard for its graveyard effect. I have the Charmers, excluding the water one because I haven't crafted her yet. I use these to link up to Selene, which can be used to summon Vere and Hain from the graveyard multiple times due to the number of spells that you should have in your grave. And then I've got Masquerena and Access Code Talker, because they're just generally strong extra deck monsters. At the end of the day, I would say that the Selene package is the only necessary thing you need in your extra deck. The rest is up to you. Finally, I have a few cards that can be either fun or discount alternatives to some of the cards in the deck if you want to change it up a little bit. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail because this is going to be a long enough video without going into them too much. I just wanted to show them off and showcase that there are alternatives and many different options of cards you can play in a 60 card deck, and a lot of the time they can all work well to some extent. We have Kaiser Colosseum, Twin Twisters, Pot of Extravagance, Spell Chronicle, Hand Destruction, Smile Action, Card Destruction, and Magician's Soul. These last 2, Card Destruction and Magician's Soul, aren't exactly discount, but I do plan on running them in the future. Card Destruction I'll definitely be adding once I get a copy, and Magician's Soul I'll probably substitute for Max C once I get 3 copies. If you want some advice on what to cut for these cards, you can look at possibly swapping out Petore, Pot of Duality, Foolish Burial Goods, or possibly Spellcaster Village if you're looking to add in Smile Action. That about wraps it up for the deck breakdown. I'm going to quickly click through the cards here so that you can at least see all the cards in case I missed one or two. Then I'm going to commentate over a few games to show you how I play the deck and allow you to get some insight into what I'm thinking while I'm playing. So for our first game, I'm going to show you how to play the deck under optimal conditions, which usually means that you're going first, you have grass in your starting hand, and your opponent doesn't have any hand traps. This means that we are very likely to be able to build a full board with ease. In this game, in our hand, we have Holiday and Secret Village. Holiday will help us to get Vere or Hain onto the field, and Secret Village will be a cherry on top to finish the board. So here we go. Before we go through each card, you'll see that we discarded a restage, so we can add one of the Magician's hands to our hand. I tend to prefer the right hand, even in this instance where we have Secret Village, because it's just an extra layer of protection if they do have a way to deal with Secret Village, and they're not going to be able to activate a trap on their turn, so I can worry about traps next turn. From this point, my end goal is to get Vere onto the board as well as Buy Street. That should be the bare minimum you try to achieve on turn 1. It's not the end of the world if you don't, but it's a simple yet strong first turn. So let's take a look at the cards we've got into the grave and work out how we're going to achieve this. So the Witchcrafter cards that we sent to the graveyard were Creation, Draping, Hain, By Street, Shmieta, Vere, and a second copy of Draping. From here we can formulate a play that allows us to build our minimum board state. Vere and By Street are easy. By Street will set itself from the graveyard at the end of our turn, and Vere we can just summon using Holiday in our hand. So let's start with that. Now it's time to improve on our minimum viable board. Hain is the next monster you want, and because she's in our graveyard, along with Holiday, we have a way to get her out. We will use Shmieta to get Genny into the grave, which allows us to use Genny's effect to copy Holiday. Now that we have a second use of Holiday, we can summon Hain. That's about all of the setup we're able to do for now, so we will use our 2 spells and end our turn. About the only way to make this a stronger turn 1 would be to use Creation to draw a Ruru for extra interruption, but that's not going to happen this turn. We do have Creation in our graveyard, so that will add itself to our hand at the end, so we will be able to make this play next turn. It's also worth noting that we have Lost Wind in the graveyard, and we'll be able to play this to the field if the opponent summons from the extra deck. Our 3 different spells in our grave trigger their effects, and we now have 2 spells in the hand and 1 on the field, which we can use as fodder for our 2 witch effects. Our opponent is playing Hero, and chooses not to play into our max C, and on top of this our field spell is preventing them from using any spell cards, so they are unlikely to be able to play all the cards in their hand. When our opponents make a weak second turn, then you can sometimes look to OTK them if the right cards are in your hand or the graveyard. These include Collaboration or Unveiling. Unfortunately, we don't have access to these cards right now. We could try to dig for them with Reasoning, but that's a long shot, and based on their first turn and with max C in our hand, I would say that we are likely to win this one without taking too much risk. We have 2 Witchcrafters on the field, so we can return their set cards to the hand to allow us to conduct the battle phase uninterrupted. A slight misplay here, I choose to use Creation to get a Ruru into my hand. Had I just saved it until after the battle phase, I would have gotten an extra 1000 damage onto the opponent, but that doesn't seem to matter at the end of the day. We go into the battle phase and use Vere's effect to help clear the board. Usually you want to keep Vere in defense position, however I'm feeling pretty safe at this point, and I do have Patronus on the field. This will add a Witchcrafter spell to our hand, allowing Vere to effectively have 3000 attack points. And notice that neither of our Witchcrafter spells return to our hand. This is because we used each of their effects already this turn. Again, another weak turn from our opponent, and they end their turn. Before we let that happen though, we will trigger Patronus to +1 by returning Shmieta to the deck. The opponent doesn't read the effect and uses max C. Because I want to end this duel this turn, I add Collaboration. Additionally, we draw a spell card which will help us win, and we +1 again with Patronus. At this point I don't need to get fancy with it. I could use Unveiling to summon a Ruru to get maximum damage, but I have Lethal on the board right now, so I just go straight for it. I use Collaboration on Hain for a double attack, and boost her attack by 3000 and swing for Lethal. On to the next game. So in this game we don't have grass in our starting hand, so we're going to have to try and dig for it. We currently have a few ways to go about this. Because we have Left Arm Offering, we are able to banish our hand to draw grass However, we don't want to do that unless we have to. And we also don't want Left Arm Offering to get Ash Blossomed, so we need to use some of our other methods first to try and bait out any hand traps. We have Petore and Metal Foes Fusion, so this gives us 2 draws in our hand already. So we'll start with these, and even if Petore gets ashed, we will still be able to use Metal Foes for a draw, and possibly then go into Unveiling to get Hain on the board. It's not an ideal first turn, but sometimes you gotta make do when you get hand trapped. So let's do it. Petore onto the board, and tributes with Metal Foes Fusion. We're going to bring out Shmieta. If Petore had gotten ashed, we were going to use Unveiling on Hain. However, because she didn't, we can now use Shmieta to bring out our Vere, and use Shmieta's Graveyard effect to bring By Street into play. But first we're going to draw. Metal Foes draws Pot of Duality. Unfortunately, we cannot use it this turn because we have already special summoned. So we're going to use Shmieta's Draw effect and discard Unveiling. And there we have it. We have managed to draw Grass. We can use it straight away because we know we won't get hand trapped. Restage got discarded, so we +1 with right hand. And let's take a look at the other cards we sent to the grave. We sent Patronus, Draping, Aruru, which you don't want to send. We sent both copies of Vere, which is unfortunate as well, because you don't want both in the graveyard. You usually want one in the grave and one in the deck so that you have multiple ways to summon her. Maybe it would have been smart to summon her before using Grass with Shmieta, but usually I like to do the summoning after I've used Grass, because then I have a better idea of how the rest of the turn is going to play out. We also sent Masterpiece, which is good, Collaboration, and finally we sent our Snow. Having Snow and Patronus in the graveyard is a really strong combo, because you can banish your Witchcrafter spells to summon Snow, and then add them straight back to your hand with Patronus. Now this wasn't the greatest Grass, because it really only leaves us with one play to get our Vere onto the field, and that involves getting a copy of Holiday and Genny into the graveyard, which will require us to discard 2 non-Witchcrafter spells from our hand, which isn't ideal, but sometimes you gotta do it. So we're going to use Shmieta to summon Genny, and Genny to summon Hain. We can now put Holiday into the graveyard with Shmieta, and use Genny to copy Holiday's effect to summon Vere. Because we used Shmieta to send Holiday to the graveyard, we won't get By Street onto the field, but we do have Snow, so missing By Street isn't the end of the world. Again, we have 3 cards for our Witchcrafter's effect, which is the sweet spot. 2 is about the minimum you want, which will allow you to destroy and negate once. With the extra card, you can also use it to boost up the attack of the spellcaster monster by 1000. And remembering that we do have Patronus in the graveyard with a banished Holiday, so should we need to get another card into our hand, we can. All that hard work to get Vere out, and we get Kaiju'd. You hate to see it. So this opponent is playing a bizarre Time Lord Kaiju Stall Burn deck, but with Snow in the graveyard, we don't have to worry too much about the opponent having lethal, so we will just let them play out their turn and see what we have to work with by the end. So they didn't have lethal, and I didn't need to summon Snow, which puts us in a good place. And they only have 1 card we need to worry about, which is Lancelot. This card has a negate, so we want to get rid of this before we try to do anything on our turn. So we go straight into the battle phase and swing into it with our monster, courtesy of our opponent. And now we can play without the fear of interruption. Because Unveiling is a quick play spell, we can summon Hain during the battle phase to get some extra damage onto our opponent. I want to get Vere back onto the field, and this is one of the instances where our extra deck comes in handy. We can use Snow to link up into a Charmer, and a Charmer to link up into Selene, and then straight into Vere. Notice that when I summoned Snow, I banished as many Witchcrafter spells as I could. This is so that we can get maximum value from Patronus in the grave. To finish off this turn, I decide to summon a Ruru from the grave. This is so that her effect will add her back to my hand, and I'll be able to use her on the opponent's turn should I need to. The opponent knows that they can't attack into me because of Vere's negate, so they end their turn to face their demise. We can negate the Time Lord and swing for lethal, and that's a win. In game 3 we have a decent starting hand. We have a Ruru already in hand, which can make for a strong turn 1, and Pot of Prosperity to search for grass. I lead with Shmierda to see if they have a Maxi in their hand, and then follow with Pot of Prosperity. In this case here, I would prefer to have my Pot of Prosperity get ashed rather than my Shmierda, so we're going to try and bait it out. If the pot gets ashed, we will use Shmierda and Left Arm Offering to summon Vere, and use Shmierda in the graveyard to send my street to the grave. It wouldn't be ideal, but again, when you get hand trapped, you've got to make do with what you've got. Pot doesn't get negated, but we reveal 6 useless cards, so this changes our line of play, and means we are going to have to use Left Arm Offering to get ourselves a copy of Grass. We add By Street because it's the best revealed card, and summon Vere using it. And go straight into Left Arm to get Grass, and straight into Grass. Again we trigger Restage. This time we landed both, and still had both hands in the deck, so we get a +2 there. As for the other discarded cards, we now have in the grave a Draping, Patronus, Pottery, Shmierda, Patronus number 2, Shmierda number 2, Collaboration, Creation, Lost Wind, Genny, and Shmierda number 3. This is a pretty strong graveyard that gives us enough effects to carry out a long game should we need to. Now the best combo we have in the grave currently is Pottery and Patronus. If we are able to empty our hand, we can add Patronus to our hand, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We activate both of our hands and return Patronus. Unfortunately, because we played Left Arm Offering, we are locked out of setting cards this turn, so we will have to save it until next turn. Because we already have By Street in the graveyard, Shmierda is free to add other cards to the grave. This game we choose to send Masterpiece. I choose this because it allows us to summon Hain on the opponent's turn, and because we have a Patronus in the grave, we can banish Witchcrafter spells and add them back to our hand straight away. We end our turn and return all the cards to our hand. My nemesis, Adamantipator's. This is by far my least favourite deck to verse in the current meta. So I have to go straight into Masterpiece to bring out Hain, otherwise their combo can get a little bit too out of control and I'll struggle to keep my board. negate that effect. We don't want them searching for more cards. And as is to be expected, they have another in their hand. We also don't want that searching, so we pop him. Lost Wind triggers because of an extra deck summon, and they choose poorly and choose to get rid of Right Hand and not Pie Street. They link up into Unicorn. And for some reason they choose to link into Underworld Goddess rather than Access Code Talker, which is good for us because that means our Lost Wind survives the turn. They are now all out of gas, so we can just take control of the board and win the game. Lost Wind to negate. Schmierda adds Holiday to the grave. Genny summons Vere using Holiday. And we add Pittore to our hand to summon Hain. And swing into them. Just to get fancy with it, I choose to pull off a Selene combo, but this didn't add any value at this point in the game. With one card in hand, they forfeit. For our last game, we are going second with a very average hand, so let's see how we can make it work. Our opponent is playing an Orcus deck. I have no idea how this deck works, but I don't have any hand traps, so it doesn't really matter. Dingirsu is a little bit scary. And they end on Masquerena and this skeleton guy. Now I'm kind of worried about this skeleton guy because they can summon a monster from the graveyard, which I suspect they want to use to summon Dingirsu back from the grave. But I have Called by the Grave up my sleeve, so I'm safe from that. Restage isn't a bad draw. We can use it with Schmierda to +1. They go straight into their Link summon and summon another Orcos monster. And there you have it. They try to summon Dingirsu and die Called by the Grave. Because they have a set card, I choose to add the left hand so that I can hopefully catch them out. And we are now safe to use Left Arm Offering to search for grass. Grass feels so good going second against combo decks like this one because they only have 28 cards left in their deck, which means we are able to get huge amounts of value. And boom, 24 cards sent to the grave. With this many cards sent to the graveyard, it's safe to assume that you sent everything you need to. I'll quickly scroll through the grave so you can see what I sent, but I won't go through every possible play you can make here. I try to negate and destroy this link monster, but apparently you can't do that in the one chain, and you need to do it separately. Oh well, you live and you learn. We still have 3 cards to use for our Witchcrafters, so we don't miss out on too much due to the misplay. They try to use Gizmek to destroy Hain. Note that the Vere cannot be targeted while Hain is on the field, and we can negate this. They link into Unicorn and return Hain to the deck, but we can trade 1 for 1. They resummoned Ingursu, but it's still under the effect of Called by the Grave, unfortunate for them. Link into access code Talker. Now this is a card that you will see often as a Witchcrafter deck because it's often many players' last out in matches after you have negated, destroyed, or interrupted the majority of their combos. Now this card isn't something you need to be afraid of when you're playing Witchcrafters. In the worst case scenario, it sends some of your cards to the graveyard and then smacks you for 5300. You're just going to bring back all your cards next turn, so you haven't really lost all that much. And a lot of the time you have cards in the graveyard to deal with the situation, just like we do here. The key to making these plays work is to let them do what they want during the main phase, and then strike during the battle phase once access code Talker can no longer use its effect. They swing for my life points and I trigger Masterpiece, banish 8 cards to summon Vere from the deck, making sure to banish as many Witchcrafter cards as possible. I put Vere in attack position because we're about to return a lot of cards to the hand with Patronus, which will prevent them from attacking into Vere unless they choose not to read. This player chose to read and realised that their last ditch access code Talker had been beat, so they did. So that about wraps it up for the replays and the deck breakdown. I'd like to thank you for watching. This video took quite a bit of work to put together, so unfortunately I probably won't be doing another one like this anytime soon, as I just don't have the time to work on them. But I will still be putting out highlight videos a few times a week, and I have a different one coming out soon, so come back to check that one out in the near future. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see ya.